1 ATP per NADH to actively transport that NADH into the mitochondria. We're moving 2 of them, so it costs us 2 ATP. So the reduction here is due to that active transport of the NADH produced in the cytoplasm during glycolysis to actively transport that into the mitochondria, where it will then be utilized in electron transport.
Repeat like towards the end of that.
It's to actively transport the NADH from the cytoplasm into the mitochondria. Questions about that?
So it's basically saying the actual number is 36 because it takes 1 molecule of ATP to move each molecule of NADH into the mitochondria,
From the cytoplasm, yes.
glycolysis,
Yep.
to be broken down into ATP
Well, to
again.
provide the energy to make ATP.
Okay.
And
Yep.
the active transport, it starts from where to
Well,
where?
the active transport is moving the NADH from the cytoplasm to the mitochondria. Because if you look at the diagram you did of glycolysis, those 2 NADH are up in cytoplasm. Electron transport is inside the mitochondria. You gotta get those 2 things in. And it costs energy to make that work. All right, questions, comments, issues? Yes?
It's the reason that it uses active transport because the body doesn't know what to do with the NADH.
No, 'cause the molecule's too big. It's like trying to get an elephant through that door. You know, you may have had that experience helping a friend move and they've got this oversized couch and you've got a regular sized door. And sometimes the only way it works is shove.
Yeah, it would
That
break my
requires
nose doing
energy to make that happen. All right. My guess is, once you go away, by tomorrow you'll be like, wait a minute, what is this? That's what Monday's about. You can certainly during lab ask. Because will you get an essay question that says illustrate and describe the aerobic breakdown of glucose? Show me the reactions, show me how they're related, tell me how many ATP we get? Absolutely. We don't spend 25 minutes doing something for nothing. So if you're not sure of that, then have those conversations. Same thing is true with the water story and other things. There's things, that's the advantage of having Monday before lecture. It gives you a chance to have those conversations. All right, let's move on to fermentation. Fermentation occurs in anaerobic conditions. Anaerobic conditions means a lack of oxygen. And a lot of people understand that fermentation is a way that organisms can generate energy when there's no oxygen, but they often don't know why. What fermentation will do for us is fermentation gets rid of pyruvic acid. The whole goal of fermentation is to remove pyruvic acid. Remember, we said if we get rid of oxygen, electron transport shuts down. If that shuts down, Krebs cycle shuts down. If Krebs cycle shuts down, pyruvic acid builds up and glycolysis will shut down. Organisms that can do fermentation have another way of getting rid of the pyruvic acid. They still don't get Krebs cycle or electron transport and all that comes with it, but they at least can maintain glycolysis and generate some ATP. 2 is nowhere near as good as 34, but 2 is better than none. So the whole goal of fermentation is a way to get rid of that pyruvic acid. Different pathways yield different results. And I got a couple here, and I'll show you the diagram, chart later. In the case of yeast, yeast do ethanol fermentation. We use that to make bread, we use that to make alcohol. Animals do lactic acid fermentation. We use it in our muscle cells, for example. And again, we'll expand on that in a couple minutes. Let's look at yeast in a little more detail. What yeast do is they take the pyruvic acid that's produced from glycolysis, they convert it to carbon dioxide and ethanol or ethyl alcohol. Which really makes yeast the most utilized microorganism in all of human history. Because human beings have been making bread almost back to before recorded history. Also been making wine. We're not the only animals to make wine. Yeah, there's several other animals that actually cultivate grapes and then consume the alcohol. Elephants do. Bees do, actually. Bees get drunk.
Some birds.
Some birds, there's a few others. Some rodents. Some rodents actually eat the grapes and then harbor the yeast in their jowls and just hold it in their mouth for a week until it ferments and then they drink it. But if we look at these things, if we're making bread, for example, which of those two byproducts are we interested in? The CO2 or the ethanol?
CO2.
CO2. That's what makes bread poofy. What makes bread rise. Think about it, if you make, and you may not have even realized this before, but if you bake and you make bread, that yeast is a living thing.
Yes, it is.
It's in a dormant state when it's in its little packet.
Wait for it to
But
dry.
think about it, you take that yeast, what do you mix the yeast with and let bloom before you mix everything else in? A little bit of water. Can the
Mhm.
water be hot?
More like room
More
temperature.
warmish. If that water is over 105 degrees,
Yeah,
you get flat bread because you kill the yeast.
Mm-hmm.
But then you think about it, you add sugar. Sugar is going to get broken down to glucose. You also add salt because you don't want the yeast growing out of control. You put it in, you let it rise. Now, does that mean that there is ethanol in bread dough? Sure it does. Last time I checked, when you go to Stop and Shop, they don't card you and you get some Wonder Bread, do they?
No,
So what happens to the alcohol?
burns off.
Put it in the oven, burns away. So does that mean you can get drunk on bread dough? Yes.
Eat enough of it.
Problem is you'd have to eat about 2.5 loaves of raw bread dough before you'd feel that effect.
Yeah,
My
Yeah.
guess is you'd be so sick by then it wouldn't matter.
yeah. Better off just going by it.
It's the same reason why, we look at unleavened bread or pita bread. That's just bread they bake before they let it rise. That's all. You still mix it with yeast. You just let it rise for, 10 seconds and then bake it rather than letting it rise over time. Well, what about if we're making wine? Which of those two are we interested in?
Ethanol.
We're interested in the ethanol. Well, again, in wine there's CO2, but what happens to the CO2? It dissipates. Why? Where do we house wine while we let it age?
And big old wooden
Wooden barrels.
barrels.
Wooden barrels are not airtight. CO2 vents away. If we're talking about champagne or sparkling wine, then one of both. The only difference between wine and sparkling wine is fermented in the bottle. Assuming you're buying good champagne, buy the cheap crap, it's the $2 wine, they just blow CO2 in from a tank, put a cork on and sell it at $5.
Mm.
Now, you ever wonder why you go to the store, somebody, you get $5 champagne and $90 champagne? There's a reason. Because the $5 champagne, nobody would drink anyway. But that's going to allow that, together you ferment them in the bottles. Muscle cells. one of you has experienced this at some point in time. Because believe it or not, if you're going, class ends and you're walking to your car, halfway to your car, the muscles in your legs have no more oxygen left. Don't store a lot of oxygen in your muscle tissue. But you would like your muscles to still work. You don't want to have to rest for 10 minutes, every 5 minutes you walk. So what happens is your muscle cells will take pyruvic acid, convert it to lactic acid. That lactic acid is what causes muscle soreness, muscle fatigue. That's why if you're working out, there are people in the world that think that's funny. But you get that tingling sensation in the muscle, they go, feel the burn. That's what it is, it's lactic acid building up in your muscle tissue, causing damage to your muscles. Normal workouts, that's fine, because what will happen is every time you work out, you damage your muscles a little, your muscles repair that damage. One of the ways they repair it is by adding more fibers. You add more fibers, you get bigger muscles. The good thing about lactic acid, though, is your muscles sometimes are smarter than you. For example, if you decide, you're going to do a chin-up, you finally get that chin over the bar, somebody puts a shotgun at the base of your skull and says, if your chin comes below the bar, we're going to shoot you. You have incentive to stay above the bar. Are you going to be able to stay above the bar indefinitely? No. Because what will happen is before you actually physically, and sometimes you can tear a muscle, it's hard to do that, but rather than physically tearing the tissue itself, you get too much lactic acid in your muscles will simply stop working. It's called fatigue. They just stop working. And even when that happens, you ever notice if you're holding something heavy, first it'll start shaking? That shaking is because more fibers are fatiguing, others are trying to catch that weight. Eventually you're going to drop whatever you have. And it doesn't need to be a lot of weight. When I do this at the high school, I have all the kids just hold their biology book. Hold it out in front of them on their fingertips. The longest the kid has lasted is 4.5 minutes. Because if you have to hold it here, you've got tremendous weight supported really in the back muscles and the shoulder muscles, etc. And eventually they drop the book. They like it, whoever lasts longest gets extra credit, and they will kill people for extra credit. I've never understood it. You can give them a 20-question test and 1 extra credit point. They'll go nuts on that 1 point. It's like, but if you just get the other 20 right, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Gotta love adolescence. All right, here we just have some examples. It's not a lot of them. But we can actually make different products. The good thing is these first two, you already know about now. If we're doing ethanol, notice how this is how we call it. Ethanol fermentation starts with sugar, ends with ethanol. We use it to make drink, we use it to make bread. Yeast is the organism that does that. Everything else is bacteria.
Fuel is a bacteria.
Say again?
Fuel is a bacteria.
Fuel.
Is a bacteria.
No. If you get here, let me get down there in a second. These are the organisms that do this kind of fermentation. In the case of lactic acid fermentation, other than your muscles, there are bacteria that do that, and that's what yogurt is made from. You put bacteria, if you've ever seen, if you look at the yogurt, it says made with active cultures. I hope so, otherwise you don't have yogurt. You take cream, add bacteria, let the bacteria break it down, it's going to produce that lactic acid, which has a little bit more bitter taste. We call it yogurt. There are other bacteria that can do something called heterolactic fermentation. It's how we make sauerkraut. It's how we make kimchi. Kimchi is amazing. I love kimchi. As long as you don't know how they make it, kimchi is great. Because to make good kimchi, you shred cabbage, mix it with salt, and usually a
Put it in the
couple of
ground.
herbs. Put it in a clay pot. Bury that clay pot in the ground for either 6, 12, or 20 years. Dig it up and eat it. As long as you get away from that part. It's much sweeter than sauerkraut. It's a Korean coleslaw, but it's much different in texture than coleslaw. It's actually pretty good. But butanol, we can take molasses, add bacteria to it, and make butanol, which is a form of butane. We can use it for all kinds of industrial things.
Yeah, I know quite a few.
This is happening all the time, this methane. There's other bacteria that can take a variety of material. They do methane or methanol fermentation, and we use it to make fuel. We have a plant that does that right over at landfill. Yeah,
What type of bacteria? Is it just,
There's varieties of them.
okay.
Back in the landfill, we don't even worry about it. Because there was a time in the landfill where as you make a landfill, you have to put pipes in it with vents. And they used to just light the top of the pipes because methane will build up in that landfill. You need to light the top to burn off the methane so the landfill doesn't blow up.
Mm.
Well, set about 20 years ago now, they realized they still have all the pipes running through the landfill, but they collect all that methane, run it under the road over to the recycling facility, burn the methane there, and use that to generate electricity. It's actually called, a lot of times now they're known as fuel cells, biological fuel cells, where you can break down material, generate methane. Methane is natural gas, so we can use it for alternative energy sources. So, does anybody have some questions? All right, we good with this? So, yep,
Is that the same concept they use like in water plants?
yes.
Okay.
Yep, in fact, if you go to the Cranston water treatment plant, they still have a perpetual torch on the side of the property that's just lit all the time. That's burning off the methane that's being produced by the organisms that are feeding off the waste.